And right now, it is my immense pleasure, and also just a reminder, there is that chat box, so if you do have questions that come up during the day, please note who you are asking the question of and put it in the chat box and we'll get to it. I do have the immense pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. She's well known across Canada, but here is some background information. Cindy Blackstock was born in Burns Lake. I did not know that. I was born in Burns Lake. And so was Warner, so we already love her. She's a member of the Gitxsan First Nation, and she's the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. She's also a professor at McGill University School of Social Work. She has a BA from UBC and 2 master's degrees in management from McGill and jurisprudence in children's law and policy from Loyola University in Chicago, and a PhD in social work from the University of Toronto. For over 30 years, Cindy has worked on behalf of Indigenous children and their rights in child welfare and equality. With First Nations colleagues, Cindy successfully challenged Canada's federal government on human rights and equitable child and family services, implementing Jordan's principle. This hard-fought litigation has changed the lives of thousands of Indigenous children, youth, and families. A little bear joined Cindy on many of her court hearings to remind everyone that each case was about children. This stuffed bear was given to Cindy by Sekani Family Services' Mary TG and is now known as Spirit Bear. Spirit Bear has been featured in a book and now a movie called Spirit Bear and Children Make History to teach children about equality and human rights. Spirit Bear has been officially admitted to the Bear by the Indigenous Bar Association and has a PhD from the University of Victoria. A Globe and Mail article described Cindy Blackstock as Canada's relentless moral voice for First Nations equality. Sekani Family Services is proud to present our keynote speaker for our 31st Annual General Assembly. Please welcome Dr. Cindy Blackstock.
Hello, everyone. I hope that you can hear me. My name is Cindy Blackstock, and I am really honored to join you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. I want to just pay my respects to all of the elders, the children, the young people, and the leadership, and of course everyone from Sekani Family Services. From both myself, Spirit Bear, and the entire Caring Society team. I'm going to take you through a little bit of a presentation on what some of the national developments are regarding the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders as well as C-92, and end with some ways that all of you can help make a difference, because it's really a critical time. And as many of you know, Patty Hadju was just named minister on this file. So she has to make some important decisions within the next 48 hours. So we'll just turn to the first slide, please. So as all of you know all too well, is that right now there are more First Nations children in care than during residential schools. But the good news is that we know what the factors are driving it. It's things like poverty, poor housing, caregiver substance misuse, and multi-generational trauma. It's very important that we address all those things. And it's also the good news is, thanks to the work, advocacy work at Warner, Mary, and many others, we've had the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal weigh in and say that First Nations child welfare and Jordan's principle ought to be equitably funded. And that's a legal order. Now that happened in 2016. So the federal government ought to have implemented that immediately. But of course we know the story is that they did not. They did not implement it immediately, and we've had now 20 non-compliance orders at the tribunal level. So what does this all mean for people on the ground? Next slide. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission listed child welfare as a #1 call to action, Jordan's principle is #3. When the Prime Minister came to power in 2015, he adopted all the calls to action. And I remember thinking to myself, well, the ruling will be coming out very shortly, and this sounds really good. The government is going to comply. That was wrong. So what happened is that the federal government actually implemented a funding regime that was developed under the previous conservative regime and was never changed despite the tribunal's order. So for those of you who got a long memory, you'll remember back in 2016, they rolled out $71 million, which was just a drop in the bucket, totally not compliant. And that spurred this whole non-compliance procedure before the tribunal that is held onto jurisdiction. We've now had, as I say, 20 non-compliance orders and procedural orders, and there are likely more to come before we're done in terms of eradicating the discrimination in child and family services and Jordan's Principle. The other important things has happened since the affirmation of the Survivors' Truce into Kamloops and other First Nations, where children's burial places have been brought to public attention by the survivors and by the leadership in those different communities. Now, shortly after Kamloops, the federal government was going to litigate against First Nations children in federal court on two of the tribunal's orders. The first is Jordan's Principle being eligible for, is the First Nations children without Indian Act status being eligible for Jordan's Principle off reserve. The second order is compensation for the victims of discrimination, not just children in care. Some of the children in care, yes, but their families who lost them due to Canada's discriminatory funding, and also the parents and the children who are denied services under Jordan's Principle. Now, those two cases were set for litigation just 2 weeks after the affirmation of the Survivors' Truce into Kamloops. The Parliament brought together a unanimous motion that the government ought to stop litigating against First Nations kids in court and stop litigating against survivors of residential schools in court. That passed unanimously. The Prime Minister and his cabinet abstained from that. And the reason they abstained is the very next week they were in federal court litigating against First Nations children. And some of you will remember the Prime Minister on the floor of the House of Commons making the statement that he was not litigating against First Nations children. The political spin seems to be, well, we're appealing a tribunal order, so that's really what we're doing. But the end result is, had Canada been successful, is that First Nations recognition of their members off reserve for the purposes of Jordan's Principle would not have stood as a legal requirement, and compensation order would have been quashed in its entirety. I know some of you have heard from the minister saying, oh, we're just seeking clarification. That was not what they were seeking. They were seeking a full quashing of the compensation order. So this litigation happens, and then we have, in fact, during the debate, in the lead up of the election, the Prime Minister reiterated his statement that the children are not being fought against by his government in court. And of course, that's not true. So there's been a whole pile of these statements being made politically that really amount to a kind of, as they say in Alberta, all hat and no cattle, kind of really public relations statements and contrary positions being taken, contrary to reconciliation in the courtroom. I'll just go to the next slide, please. So right now, where we're at is that we have 3 orders that are looking like they're probably going to go to appeal, one for sure. The first order that is the federal government filed for appeal on from the tribunal is regarding capital. That is capital for First Nations agencies as well as for communities under Jordan's Principle. The federal government does not want to pay for capital at actual cost. And so on the very day that the 2 Michaels returned from China, the federal government snuck in this appeal to the federal court. So we are going to federal court at this point. And as you'll note later, one of the things I'm going to ask leadership to do is really press the new minister to withdraw this appeal, because we haven't had hearings on that yet. That's yet to come. We have had a case management judge assigned by the Chief Justice, and that case management justice, Justice Fable, who just decided in the children's favor on the compensation and Jordan's Principle decision. So that brings me to that decision. So I really, really recommend, I know leadership is really busy, but I recommend everybody read that federal court decision because it really lays out nicely the history of this long litigation and also defeats all of these various jurisdictional arguments the federal government was relying upon. I think that Justice Favel did a very good job of saying, here is the argument and here's what the law says. And the law does not side with Canada, it sides with the children. So that was issued on September 29, 2021. That's a day before, of course, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, Orange Shirt Day for the survivors. The federal government has until October 29th, 2021 to decide whether it will appeal that decision in whole or in part to the Federal Court of Appeal. That is the decision the minister must make today, along with the prime minister. So really, we're looking at 48 hours or so before they have to file. I think they're going to appeal. I don't know what that appeal will look like. I can tell you that there is a lot of media interest in this, so I'd really recommend that leadership be prepared to respond to media statements. And as I say, as quickly as you can, get a hold of the new minister and tell her not to appeal these two decisions. They need to put down their sword and stop fighting First Nations kids in court, right? So that's where we are with the appeals. And just a reminder to many, the Federal Court of Appeal is just one below the Supreme Court. So if we go to the Federal Court of Appeal, we've been there before once, the next rank up is the Supreme Court, and then that's the end of the game, at least on those two issues. Next slide. Now, one of the things that we're actually thinking of, a non-compliance order, is on Jordan's Principle. There's a host of concerns about Jordan's Principle, but one of them is this uneven application of Jordan's Principle. Children in British Columbia are least likely of anywhere in the country to be approved for a Jordan's Principle request. There are more denials in BC than any other region. And we're not satisfied with the explanations that have been provided to us as to why those denial rates are so high in British Columbia region. And we're also concerned about Canada's kind of really going around and kind of improperly questioning professional judgments on what children need, taking long times to determine the cases that exceed the tribunal's order, the timelines, not properly classifying urgent cases. So we have regularly brought this to the federal government's attention. We've provided possible solutions. The federal government has not taken the action needed to address the discrimination at the level of the child. So if we do not hear back from the federal government about specific actions they've taken to remediate the discrimination at the level of their children, then it's the Caring Society's intention on November 15 to file another non-compliance motion with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. So just to advise leadership of that. Next slide, please. So this is an order and the Jordan's Principle order, but I really want to kind of spend some time on this as a bridge to C92. First of all, before I get into this, I just want to really emphasize that the federal government is now saying that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders only apply to First Nations agencies. They have another funding arrangement for First Nations under C92 that, in my view, is seriously flawed. So it really is in the best interest for First Nations to proceed cautiously and really work with the experts who are the agency experts who have been doing this work for many years to help collaborate on a path forward for self-determination. And here's one of the warning signs. So the federal government is saying that C92 is really about affirming First Nations jurisdiction and self-determination. And yet at the same time, it is appealing an order that recognizes First Nations self-determining of who their members are off reserve for the purposes of eligibility for Jordan's Principle. This is, in my knowledge, the very first legal order we've had that recognized the federal government's obligation to fund First Nations children recognized by their nations off reserve. And I want to just make a point. Jordan's Principle is not a program. So there's not like $5 million for Jordan's Principle. And once that's tapped out, then nobody gets it. It really is a legal order. So the more children who benefit from it, then the more money Canada has to pay. And the other important piece about this order is it provides monies to First Nations to develop these recognition processes and implement them. That's what Canada challenged at the federal court. That's a decision that they lost. They are now thinking about whether or not they're going to appeal that decision. It'll be very, very important to watch what they do here, because at the same time on C-92, they're saying they're not funding off reserve, that it's up to the provinces to do that. But the feds have no serious answer to what happens when the provinces choose not to do it or do so inadequately. And we've all seen in BC politics up and down in terms of who's in power. So even if you got a decent deal today, there's no guarantee that the province would fund adequately down the road under C-92 as it's currently configured. Next slide, please. So here's the answer on how to structure child welfare funding. The good news is we've had First Nations-led research for over 25 years on this particular program. The key is this, and if I could have two take-home messages, it would be this. Number one is structure of funding is more important than the amount. Because if you fund according to outcomes for your children and families that deal with those drivers, remember, those drivers are not within the federal government's narrow conception of what child welfare is. But they are the drivers that drive kids into care. Poverty, poor housing, substance misuse, mental health. We need to get at those. They need to be adequately funded in order for First Nations laws to have adequate effect. So this funding arrangement by the IFSD funds towards those outcomes. You would include those outcomes in your funding arrangement, and you would say that the federal government has to fund until your members reach a proper standard, i.e., that their poverty's been eradicated to a level where it no longer poses a significant risk. When you fund towards an outcome like that, then you can litigate against that. You could say, Canada, you have not funded adequately in order for our children to reach the standard, and here's the amount. If Canada gives you a money amount, then it's very difficult to litigate against that. And I will, I say that based on my 15 years of experience having done this. And often what we've seen in the past is they will offer what appears to be quite a generous amount, but it's structured improperly. And it doesn't take very long at all to run aground on that money and to be in a situation where you're not able to implement your laws or your programs in a way that makes sense. So just to highlight this, I know people like Mary know a lot about it. Helena Gaspard's been to Carrier Territory before to do it. And there's a phase 3 coming out where they'll be looking for volunteers to model this approach. So in the true spirit of self-determination, you'll be able to model what this funding approach would look like before it's implemented, not after, so that you would have a better sense as to whether this would meet your nation's needs. Next slide. So here's my big caution on this act. I see the federal government is now floating around a health act too. All of these are being floated under the auspices of affirming self-determination. The first thing I would say about that is absolutely welcome, but this is a very narrow conception of what child welfare is. In my view, when I've spoken to First Nations, the traditional laws that they had were more clan laws, family laws, that kind of stuff. This deals with only the narrow slice of child and family in a very Western orientation. So just to be aware of that, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's just to be aware of that. But most of what I can offer is really on the funding side. The federal government has said under sworn testimony that it views that the orders do not apply as soon as you draw down jurisdiction. And we've seen some early funding agreements, and they largely immunize Canada from any further funding issues. They do say things like, well, if we improve it later, you can get the money. The problem with that kind of approach is we've seen it before with the feds, where they've actually, under the enhanced prevention framework, said to some nations who signed early that you could benefit from improvements down the line, and those improvements never came. So these agreements must be structured properly. Canada's interim funding arrangement is a replication of what was found discriminatory in the tribunal. And you need to think about, we've been at this now for 15 years at the tribunal, nearly, whether or not you have capacity to actually enforce your agreement to a very resistant litigant. I'm worried that they're looking at this as an escape hatch from the tribunal's orders. We must not allow that to be the case. Canada must be required to fund on an equitable level. Next slide. So here's a kind of a quick checklist. What you get under the tribunal's orders, you can see that they're legally enforceable. We have capital at actuals order, we have prevention, legal, building repairs, intake assessment, and child and care costs all at actuals. It's based on First Nations evidence of the last 25 years, and Jordan's principle orders are included in that. If you turn to what the feds are floating for the interim funding approach, it's questionable whether they're legally enforceable. You would probably have to litigate against them if there was a difference in view. There's not, from what we can see, any funding at actuals on capital. There's no funding at actuals on those other items. The funding arrangement itself is not based at all on all the evidence that First Nations have collectively put forward in the last 25 years, or the tribunal's orders. It's based on a formula from CERNA. That's it. They just brought it over, a self-government formula, not tailored to child and family, never tested on child and family. And on Jordan's principle, what the feds are saying is, yeah, the orders will apply, but only to services that are not included in a coordination agreement. Now, the worry would be is if you used a broad category in your coordination agreement, like prevention, without itemizing what that means, then the feds would be open to the feds to say, well, yeah, you made that request, but it's in your prevention funding we already gave you. And where there would be disagreements about that, that may result in the child not receiving the service until you can litigate or resolve it some other means. So what we would like to see at the Caring Society, and we have a different point of view than AFN on this, our view is we would like to see the CHRT orders made available as an option, as a minimum safeguard for First Nations, and then you can build on top of that. AFN, I don't want to speak too much to their view because they can speak for themselves, but their view is that the CHRT funding orders are under a program and that somehow infringes on self-government. But there really isn't a clear answer as to whether you took this interim funding arrangement, which is totally unilaterally created by Canada, no co-development there, whether that actually would meet your needs. I don't think it would, based on my expertise. I think you'll do fine for 4 years, and then it won't be enough money, and there's no clear pathway forward to enforce it. Next slide, please. So tips for funding to avoid. Here's some red herrings. Avoid a fixed amount adjusted by population and inflation. That is a hallmark of a discriminatory funding arrangement because it's not linked to the needs of your children or the realities of your particular community. Don't go for anything where there isn't any evidence. I mean, we're in a good place here. All of our work all over the nation for the last 25 years has created a whole series of evidence that was First Nations based that helps make us make better decisions for First Nations children and families. So don't accept something that's just being ported over from CERNA because that's the way the feds have always done things. We don't want them replicating discriminatory kinds of structures in funding. And unfortunately, that's what I'm seeing in the interim funding arrangement. And we need to question language a lot. They're using the word engage versus consultation. And that's despite UNDRIP being taken into law. Like, why are they engaging? What does that actually mean? I think that we need to have some conversations with them about the terms that they like to apply. I'd also say you shouldn't rush into anything, that you actually are really lucky in carrier territory. You've had Carrier Sekani Family Services. They have a large basis and a foundation upon which to build self-determination. But take it cautiously and look at what the feds are doing. We've been able to achieve well over $1 billion of additional assistance for First Nations families through the CHRT. They are fighting us tooth and nail. And they're touting C92. Now, the question is, is C92 a legitimate solution for First Nations children, or is it just an easy way out for the federal government? Next slide. So what to do? Structure matters. Remember, fund towards outcomes, because you can litigate against an outcome. You can say, here's where our kids should be, keeping in mind all the drivers we know about leads to overrepresentation. And this is where the federal government's funding us, which is inadequate to meet this outcome, and therefore there's a breach of human rights. You could litigate against that. Leverage First Nations research, fund on the basis of outcomes. Again, they're all there, and they can be tailored to your particular nation. One of the myths out there about this IFSD report is it's only for agencies. Nothing can be further from the truth. It's about how do we create a funding framework that really allows First Nations children to thrive, given a variety of different models that First Nations may choose to pursue. And of course, we want to make sure that we're really engaging and working together, that we don't allow the government to divide and rule us, which has so long been a strategy, either between leadership and technicians or between agencies, First Nations and other First Nations. We really should have a transparent process here. It's always dangerous when the federal government is controlling the information and are controlling who they're talking to at the table. I always worry about that. That's never really resulted in good stuff for kids. Next slide. How can leadership help? Get on your phone to Platy Hadju. Tell her congratulations on becoming minister, and tell her the first decision she needs to make is to drop those appeals. Drop the appeal of capital, drop the appeal of any appeals to the Federal Court of Appeal. And the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister needs to be held accountable for this decision-making as well. And I want to thank the First Nations Leadership Council for sending a letter to that effect already, but individual First Nations and those of you working in Child and Family ought to as well, if you're able to. The other is the Spirit Bear Plan. Remember, if you draw down jurisdiction in this one area and all of these things, these feeders, poverty, housing, all the rest of it continues to be underfunded, then really what you're doing is building self-determination on top of quicksand. You need to have all of these other areas equitably funded and to the proper target. Don't fall for things like ending long-term boil water advisories. That's not the standard for other Canadians, is ending long-term boil water advisories. The standard for other people is getting clean water in adequate amounts from your tap. And that ought to be the standard that we are able to access as First Nations as well. So Spirit Bear Plan ends all the inequalities across all of the areas. And then self-determination could really flourish. And the other thing is watch out for C92 and just really be cautious about the funding framework here. Make sure that they aren't waving self-determination out there as a carrot in order to sell you a rusty car. You have technicians there in your territory who can help inform and guide you. Certainly we're here if we can be of any assistance. But I would look at really trying to integrate those orders as a minimum standard in any funding arrangement you have. It's taken far too long for us all to fight for these things like Jordan's Principle, and we don't want to see it wiped away with a wave of a pen. So next slide. There's the Spirit Bear Plan. You can check it out on our website, and of course it's named after Spirit Bear, who's a proud member of the Sekani Tribal Council. Next slide. We have this wonderful animation which tells the story of Jordan's Principle and the Tribunal through the eyes of Spirit Bear, done by Spotted Fawn Productions. Mary the Bear is voiced by your own Mary TG. So you're welcome to reach out to us and arrange screenings of this film for your particular nations if you like. It's 23 minutes long. Next slide. And here's a sneak preview. And for those of you looking closely at the sign behind Spirit Bear, yes, that is Lake Bearbean, which is known to many of you as Lake Babine. And this is the new animation we're coming out with that talks about traditional knowledge, that talks about residential schools, and ends with Shannon's dream for safe and comfy schools and equitable education. So that should be coming out by the end of the year. And we really are looking forward to being able to share that with children in your nations. So next slide. And this is how to get a hold of us if there's anything that we could do. Take home messages again, be cautious about the funding, work with First Nations agencies and experts and leadership in order to move towards self-determination in a measured and very informed way. And let's get the Prime Minister to put down his sword against First Nations kids. There's been well over 30 orders in this case. The government has only won one, and that was overturned on appeal. So their litigation strategy is not working. They are losing horribly, but the problem is every time they fight, kids are harmed. And so he needs to stop it now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blackstock. I am so happy, and I want to thank you for your unwavering commitment to the First Nations children and for your relentlessness. I know that you've been called relentless in Canadian press, and I love that. Our kids deserve all of our relentlessness in fighting against this, and we had some calls to action or some to-do list from Cindy, which is contact your politicians and tell them to lay down their swords. I want to invite questions. If you're in the room, there is a mic at the back that you can use. And if you are online, please put your question in the chat box. So we do have some time for questions. Do we see any questions popping up? And in the meantime, yeah, I want to... Go ahead.
Hi. So far, we have one comment from the chat online, just saying thank you for the info on Jordan's Principle. I have tried to access funds in the past, and they made it so hard I just gave up. More of a comment than a question.
Were you able to hear that, Cindy?
So I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't hear you.
Okay.
Should we try that again? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me okay?
I could ask the question. I don't have access to the question as it is, but there is, I think the comment was that there is somebody in the community who has tried to access Jordan's Principle, and it was made so difficult that they just gave up. Were you able to hear that?
Yes, I was. Thank you. I just was able to hear you now. My apologies for the technical issue. What I would say about that is, unfortunately, that's not unusual. That is why we're going for another non-compliance motion. What I would recommend to that individual is where there are navigators in the community on Jordan's Principle, please reach out to them for support. And also, if you can reach out to us about the systemic issue and we'll try to resolve it as best we can. And you can reach us at info@fnCaringSociety.com. So fnCaringSociety.com.
Thank you. So again, fnCaringSociety.com is where Cindy and the people who support her work can be reached. Any other questions?
Julie, at Sekani Family Services, we do have 2 workers finally to navigate the Jordan's Principles. So if people are having difficulty with respect to accessing that resource, they could contact our office as well. And just a comment, Cindy, we did have a Chiefs meeting last week who totally support the work that you do. So I think we're going to dub you the matriarch of all children, Indigenous children in Canada. So thank you for your work. And letters will be forthcoming from the Chiefs asking the Prime Minister to stop the war against First Nations children and stop poverty.
Thanks so much, Warner, and thanks so much to the leadership and committee members. Your support really made this case possible. I mean, you can see behind me our little office here. We're just a tiny group, but we have so much prayer and support and advice from across the country, and that's what's made this success possible. And I will guarantee you that if the federal government brings that appeal, we will oppose them strenuously at the Federal Court of Appeal, and I believe that the truth will win again, and the children will win again.
Thank you, Cindy.
Hi, Cindy. We have a number of questions coming in for the chat online. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Great. So our first question is, it says, after a child ages out of 26 years old for adult agreement, can we still get funding for college or / university after age 26?
This is an awesome question, and very, very important for anyone considering C-92, because the government has defined a child as under 18 in that legislation. I believe that it's a more holistic approach that you're talking about, and that there ought to be post-majority supports for young people aging out until they no longer need them anymore. Unfortunately, the federal government takes the position that Jordan's principle ends at the age 18, and that they will only offer 2 years of post-majority services after the age of majority. That's another area where we need the support of leadership to encourage the government to meet the needs of children and young people and to catch up to the science. We know that children's brains don't start developing until they're 25. And so it just makes sense to provide those supports until that age. But right now, the answer of the federal government is no. The other thing that I should let you know is that in Winnipeg, there is a legal case where there's a challenge to expand Jordan's principle past the age of majority. And we are going to do whatever we can to support that litigation so that people have that access.
Great, thank you. Another person was wondering if you could remind us of the name of the new minister so that they can contact her immediately.
Right, thank you. It's Patty Hadju, Hadju. She used to be the Minister of Health.
Great, thank you. Another person is saying that they have been trying to get Jordan's funding for their son's braces, and they paid for over a year and are wondering if Jordan's principal would reimburse them for those payments.
It's something to check out with the navigator that Warner was just speaking with. Certainly, we've had cases where parents have had to front the money and then got reimbursed later. So they definitely should speak to the navigator and pursue that.
Great, thank you. Another person is saying that it was very interesting to see the stats, and they're wondering, how do we keep them accountable and on task? We've had to engage lawyers and build additional case support, but it stays lost in the system. Who can we elevate it to?
I'm just thinking about where the case information can go. If it's on a systemic issue, and you feel it's something that we could actually amplify and support you with in terms of implementing a solution to address it, then please let us know. And of course, Warner and Mary know how to get a hold of us, and they're also sitting at national tables. So that information could be fed up so that we're actually targeting and holding the federal government accountable, not only through the CHRT process, but other processes.
Great, thank you. I think so far that's all the questions coming in directly for Cindy.
Thanks. Those are the online questions. Thanks for the moderation from the communication team. And are there any other questions in the room? We do have the mic at the back if somebody has a question. And I just want to reiterate Warner's point is that there are navigators at Sekani Family Services, and you can contact the agency to be in connection with them to receive that support.
And I have to say, the amazing work that Sekani Family Services does is really they are a national innovative. When I get asked about where to go to learn how to do this stuff, I always point to that agency. So cheers to the board, to the staff, and to the leadership for all the work that you've done together. And the amazing young people. I've gone to the youth center. It's one of my favorite places to go in Prince George.
Thank you, Cindy. And speaking of leadership, we do have Chief Karina Lewin at the mic in the back.
Hi, Cindy. Thanks for the presentation. Always informative when I listen to you speak, the passion that you have. So just on behalf of my community and leadership, I'd like to thank you for your tireless work to push the files forward for our children. And really excited to see the new Spirit Bear animation. So it's great, and I just want to express my appreciation on behalf of all of our children.
Well, thank you, Chief. And one of my favorite parts about the Spirit Bear animation is the Spirit Bear theme song, which was written and performed by children in your territories. And the words are just amazing. It's on my iPod, and I actually listen to it every time I need an inspiration.
Thank you. You just reminded me of how emotional I felt watching that video last year, and how proud I feel of our communities and our people. Thank you so much for that. Any more questions before? And I should have taken advantage of Chief Karina Lewin, President at the mic as well, because one of the things that because I get to do it now is so happy to announce that Sekani Family Services is giving a donation of $1,500 to the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. Thank you, Cindy, for being Canada's relentless moral voice for First Nations equality. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the donation.
Thank you. I know that everyone here in the room is beaming with pride and excitement at your work. I really am so appreciative of every time that I get to hear you speak and have the pleasure of introducing you.
Well, thank you very much, and stay tuned for Friday. Hopefully the minister does not appeal, but I think they will.
Absolutely. And if you are interested in following all the breaking news, follow Cindy on Twitter. She's very active and informative and keeps you up to date on the issues. And I will be watching and crossing my fingers that Canada does the right thing. But like you, I think I'm a little cynical about them. So I'd like to, first of all, it's a little bit of housekeeping. Those of you who are joining us online, if you would like a copy of the booklet that that there is some paper copies in the room, but go to the events page, and on the agenda or on the current events, you'll see the AGA. Click on that and go to the very bottom of the page after the agenda. There's a link to download the booklet, and it is a 94-page booklet that I actually haven't even gone through in entirely, because it's packed with so much information about programs and services.